So let's get back to this button. At the moment, it isn't really a button, it's just a view with text inside of it. Now to make it a button, we need to add a component that allows us to react to presses, to taps. And React Native has a couple of components that do that, for example, the touchable components. I briefly mentioned them before. In the past, these were the main components you would use for adding touch support to elements, but nowadays the pressable component is recommended. Therefore, I will use pressable here. And we can now wrap pressable around our view and text here. So we can create a pressable component here, use it in JSX like this, and wrap it around the view and text. And pressable has an onPress prop, which takes a function as a value, which ensures that this function that we pass to onPress will be executed whenever the button is pressed in the end, whenever anything inside of pressable is tapped. Now to show you how this works, I'll add a little dummy function here, press handler, and in there I will just console log pressed like this. And I want to connect this press handler to this button by pointing at press handler like this. As you learned before, we're not executing this function here, we're just pointing at it so that it will be executed for us when such a press occurs. With that, if we save this, we can now press these texts and we don't get any feedback, at least not right now. We will add some feedback soon. But in the console, we can see that indeed we did press these buttons successfully and that we listened to those events, which is another big step forward. But of course, having some styling and some feedback would be nice as well. And therefore, that's what I want to work on next. Now for adding styling, I again will import the style sheet because that is how we do define our styles typically when working with React Native. And we can add such a styles constant, which is a style sheet created with the style sheet create method. And now in this method here, we can define our different styles. Now I want to have a couple of different button styles, but I want to start with the main style for this container that I have around my text. So my main style for this view. So I'll name this container. And in here, I want to set a background color. And the background color I want to set is the same color I have here. So I will actually copy this color from the start game screen and use this here for my button. Now, of course, if I use the same color as I have it here for the background, it won't be visible. Therefore, to work around that, I'll change that background color in the start game screen a little bit and simply make it darker, let's say, by switching to this hex code, 4E0329. Now we have a different background color for the button, and I also want to make sure that I have rounded corners, and not just some rounded corners, but essentially no corners, but instead a nice little half circle on the left and right of the button. And this can be achieved by giving this button a huge border radius, for example, with a value of 28. I also want to have some padding in there, and I want to have different padding to the top and bottom and left and right. So I will set padding vertical, let's say to 8, and that's the padding, the distance inside of the container to the top and to the bottom. And I will add padding horizontal, so to the left and right, of 16, so that we have more padding to the left and to the right than to the top and to the bottom. In addition, on Android, I want to add a shadow, only on Android, not on iOS. You could also add an iOS shadow. You learned how that works a few minutes ago. But here I want to add a shadow only on Android by setting the elevation to 2. If we save all of this, we don't see anything because we need to apply this styling. So we can go to this view, add the style prop, and point at styles.container. And with that, if we save this, now we got these buttons here. Of course, they're still not super pretty, but we're getting here. But we also need to style the text now because the text doesn't look good. We also might want to add a little bit of margin around the button so that there is some spacing between the buttons. Hence, I will start with that and actually add a margin in all directions of 4 pixels. And I will define a second style object, which I'll name button text. And therefore, actually, I'll name this here button container to be consistent. And my button text will receive a color of white so that the text is white. And I want to center the text, which can be achieved by using text align center. Like this. And what's very important, you have to define those styles on a style object that's directly applied to this text component, because as you learned before in this course, if you would add text align center and this color prop on the button container, it would not affect the text inside of the container because there is no inheritance in this React Native styling approach. It looks like CSS, but it isn't CSS. So therefore now we can add this new style, the button text style, to this text component. And since I changed the name of the container, we also should update the name up here and point at the button container style object here. With that, if we save this and we go back, this is centered and already looks a bit nicer. We can also see that there is a slight shadow on Android, whereas there is none on iOS. Now, what we don't have at all is any feedback when a button is pressed. And that would be nice to have. Now, I did show you how you can add such feedback before. You can add feedback on Android and add a nice ripple effect by adding the Android ripple prop. And as the name suggests, this only has an effect on Android. But there you can pass an object to Android ripple, and then on this object you can set the color that should be applied when this button is pressed. So the ripple color that will be used. And ripple is this little wave effect which you get when pressing a button on Android. So here I'll set this to a color and I'll use the main button color here, but of course I'll use a slightly darker tint here, maybe like this, switching to the hex code 640233. With that, if we save that, on Android, we should have a nice little ripple effect. But actually, if you press the button, you will see a slight effect outside of the button, but not inside of it. So that is not working as intended. And I'm showing this on purpose because this can be a common problem when building custom buttons on Android, or with React Native in general. This is a common problem to run into, that the ripple effect is outside of the button, for example, and therefore I'm showing this here so that you have a solution for this common problem. Because the solution is to restructure this JSX code. What you should do is move your view outside of the pressable element, so that pressable is inside of view. And then we also need to add a new styling object and restructure our styling objects a little bit. I will actually add a button outer container here, like this, and rename this to button inner container, because we will work with 2 containers now. One container will be that view that holds the pressable, and the pressable will be the inner container that holds the text. And we need to distribute our styles across these 2 containers to make sure that they work together correctly. And what you should do now is that on the outer container, you add this border radius. You don't add it on the inner container, you add it on the outer container instead. In addition, it's that outer container that receives the margin, like this, which should make sense because it will be the outer container that will be closest to other elements that are used side by side or close to the button when you're using this button component in other components. Now, in addition, on this outer container, you should add overflow hidden, which is a property you might also know from web development. What this will do is, it will ensure that if any effect or any styling from inside that container would go outside of that container, it's clipped, it's not shown. So for example, if the ripple effect would go outside of this container, it will be clipped and it will not be visible. Now on the inner container, we want to have the background color, and we want to have the padding and the elevation. Now we can add this outer container class here to this view, which is our outer container. And on this pressable element, we can also add a style prop, and here we want to add the button inner container style. When we do that and save everything, the buttons look as they did before, but now you will see that the ripple effect is inside of these buttons. You have to watch really closely, and you can of course temporarily switch to a totally different color to make it a bit easier to spot this effect. Now you see the ripple effect is inside of the button. And I'll switch back to the other color now because I just wanted to show you that this works. So working with such combined containers is something you often need to do when building custom buttons. And now here you see one example approach of building a clean button by combining such an outer and such an inner container. Now of course at the moment though, this is nice on Android, but it has no effect on iOS because this ripple effect is only available on Android. So if you want to provide some visual feedback on iOS as well, which we typically want to, we have to set up a dedicated style for iOS. And for this dedicated style, I'll add another styling object in the primary button component file. And I'll name it pressed, because this should become active when the button is pressed. And what I want to do in that case is I want to set an opacity of 0.75. Opacity makes the element on which you apply this style transparent, and here I will make it 75% opaque, so 25% transparent. Opacity wants a value between 0 and 1, which then is translated into percentage. So 1 is 100%, 0 is 0%. Now this pressed style here, this object, should be applied to pressable when the button is pressed. And for this we can change this style prop a little bit. Because as I also mentioned before, the style prop for this pressable component takes either a styling object as we're currently passing it in, or it takes a function, for example an arrow function here, which will be called automatically by React Native whenever the pressable is pressed, so whenever the press event occurs. And then this style object receives some data about the press event, which is an object with essentially one property. And therefore we can also use object destructuring here to pull out that one property. And that one property is a pressed property. And this name is not up to you. This is a property named pressed, which is part of that object, which is automatically passed into this function by React Native for this pressable component. And pressed is a boolean, which is true if we currently are pressing the button or the element in general, and false otherwise. So now pressed can be used here in the body of this arrow function to determine which style objects should be applied. And for this, I'll check if pressed is truthy, in which case I want to apply different styles than if it's not true. If it's not true, after the colon here, I want to apply the default button inner container style. But if it is true, then I want to apply multiple styles. I do want to apply the default button styles, but I also want to add my pressed style object here. And this can be achieved by passing an array of styles. And in general, in any place where you use the style prop, even if it's not the pressable component, you can pass style objects like this, but you can also pass arrays of style objects. And in that case, all the style objects in that array would be considered by React Native. So here, I then want to add my button inner container style here, but I also want to add the pressed style. So if pressed is true, then this array of style objects will be applied to the button. If it's false, this single style object will be applied. And with that, if we save this, we now got this feedback here as well, because we got some transparency going on when we click this. On Android, we now also have this effect, and for the moment that is fine for me here. You will learn in the next section how you can differentiate between platforms and how you can write or execute different code for different platforms. So in the next section, you will learn how you can disable this styling behavior for Android and only use it for iOS. For the moment, we will use the same effect for both platforms. So we will add this opacity when the button is tapped.